the 9 books that I read in the first half of February. Hi guys, my name is Sharon. I read a mix of all genres, mainly thrillers, romance, general fiction, historical. If that sounds like your thing, please like and subscribe. I've decided I'm going to break up my reading wrap-ups into first half and second half because filming my first video and all the books I read in January just took too much brain power. Timestamps will be below in the description box. I read 5 thrillers, 2 fantasies, 1 romance and 1 general fiction. The first book I read in February was Don't Tell Me How to Die by Karp. This is a psychological thriller. We start off the book where a body has been found unalived face down in a river, and of course later on in the story you'll find out who this body is. In this story we follow Maggie as a teenager and her family. She has a sister and 2 loving parents, but when her mum gets diagnosed with a fatal blood disease, her mum's biggest worry is actually the wrong kind of woman flocking to their dad after her passing. She just knows that there'll be a line of women eager to become the next missus to her husband. When her mum finally passes, Maggie knows her and her sister need to vet all the women that her dad will potentially date. We also follow Maggie later in life as well as an adult, where she has her own family and her life is basically starting to mirror her own mother's. I will say this started off quite slow. In some portions of the book it didn't feel like a thriller, it felt more like a general fiction following this family drama. And I would say the last quarter of this book was when it really piqued my interest and picked up for me. This is really highly rated on Goodreads, and all the reviews I read were basically saying that this was such a good thriller and there was a really shocking plot twist. This book was kind of middle of the road for me for the majority of it because I had really high expectations of this, and then I finally got to plot twists and I was like, that was a good plot twist. Sometimes when you read a quite slow thriller and it feels very middle of the road for the most part, but then I'll get to the plot twist and the plot twist will be worth it. Honestly guys, the plot twist was really good. I think the book was worth the read just for the plot twist alone, and it made me rethink everything. Definitely recommend if you like an underrated psychological thriller with a really good plot twist. Then I read The Fix by Sheridan. This is a dark, gritty psychological thriller where you follow 2 characters, Cammy and Rex. They start off as teenagers in this book, and Cammy is rich, beautiful and popular, whereas Rex is more of the loner type. Rex has been in love with Cammy for quite some time, loving her from afar. Then one day he finally gets to speak to her. But later that day, when Cammy is at home with her mum and her sister, there's a horrible home invasion. Trigger warning, this is a really dark and disturbing thriller. There is on-page essay in this book and I really didn't need to read that. It was awful and I've tried to erase it from my memory. Cammy manages to survive, and this of course changes Cammy's life forever. You then follow Cammy and Rex later in their life as adults. Cammy has managed to pick up the pieces of her life after this disaster, but one day she receives this weird, mysterious phone call presenting her with something called a do-over. This whole book, I was just like, this poor girl Cammy, she had to deal with this. I only knew Sheridan as the author of Archer's Voice, which is a small town romance. I read that years ago, and I actually had no idea she wrote thrillers until I came across this book. But I think thrillers might be her calling. Besides the scene that I really hated reading, I did think this was a really good thriller. This thriller had a bit of everything. There was suspense, tension, romance, and it was really dark and disturbing, but also really emotional. I was really satisfied with the ending. I then read the poet Empress by Shen. This is an ancient Chinese historical / fantasy that's also a debut novel. It's set in this fictional Azalea dynasty. We follow this peasant girl, Wei Yin, who's from a family of rice farmers. They live a really hard life because their village is dealing with famine and starvation, and when she has the opportunity to become concubine to the Prince Terran, she takes it, hoping it will save her family. She then moves into the palace and has to leave her life behind. She's catapulted into this dangerous world of not only court politics, but also Prince Terran is extremely cruel. In this world, magic is harnessed from writing poetry, but women are forbidden to read and write. So naturally, this is what Wei Yin learns to do. The writing was very beautiful and I loved all the palace politics and drama. Like, give me Gossip Girl but an ancient Chinese setting, I will eat that right up. But you know, this wasn't that. This was a lot more serious. There were some really unlikable characters in here, and I really did not like Prince Terran. He was just too cruel for my liking. I think I was expecting this epic love story, and it wasn't quite that. But read this if you like a historical fantasy that's more character driven. Then I read another thriller called What Lies Between Us by John Mars. This story centers around a mother and daughter who clearly have a very toxic relationship. The mother is basically trapped in her own home because the daughter keeps her locked up in the attic. You follow both the mother and daughter's perspectives in both present day and past timelines, and you obviously follow what was happening in their life that led to this moment of the mother being chained up. I thought this thriller was okay. The characters were really unhinged. I mean, a lot of characters in thrillers tend to be unhinged anyway, but I don't know if thrillers with super unhinged characters are quite my thing. I think my favourite thriller by John Mars is still The One. Then for something a bit more lighthearted, I read That Fine Line by Cindy Steele. I wanted to read at least one romance before Valentine's Day. Cindy Steele is one of my favourite romance authors. She's quite underrated, but she has this one book called Faking Christmas, which is like my favourite Christmas romance ever. This one though is a small town romance. We follow our female main character called Kelsey, who's engaged, and she has this hotshot fiance. They live in the city in California, but Kelsey decides to go back to her small hometown to help her parents out on their farm and to also plan her wedding there. The wedding stuff is kind of stressing her out because her fiance and mother-in-law are proving to be too much. When Kelsey gets back to her hometown and her parents' farm, it's a nice change of scenery, but she reconnects with someone from her past called Cade. Cade is someone she went to school with, and when they were younger they were constantly pranking each other, but you know, Kelsey left that life behind to move to the city, but now coming back home is making her rethink everything. I really liked this one. I needed something lighthearted as a palate cleanse between all my thrillers. Also, I like my romances where the conflict isn't too heavy or tragic, and I think Cindy Steele does a really good job of doing that. Then I read The Toybox by Charly Cox. This is the second book in the Detective Alyssa Wyatt series, but it can be read as a standalone. But they kind of are spoilers for the first book because they briefly mention it. We follow the detective Alyssa as she's put on this case when a string of girls go missing. And then we also follow the perspective of the girls who do go missing. I think I've decided that I did not like this thriller. Honestly, it wasn't a bad thriller. I like Charly Cox's writing, and I liked their first book as well called All His Pretty Girls. This one was just too dark for me. In light of the news and files being released recently, this was quite reminiscent of that, and yeah, it was just too dark for me, and therefore I didn't enjoy the storyline. I spent an Audible credit on it, so I felt like I had to get through the whole thing, but really I should have just DNF'd this. Then I read another thriller, Don't Tell by Mary Stone and Matt Giegerich. Here we follow the main character Lizette, and she's a counsellor who works for a place called Camp Wildfire. It's basically this retreat where troubled teens are sent to. Lizette seemingly has this perfect life. She loves her husband and her husband loves her, and then she has this rewarding job as well. But when this new teenage girl comes to Camp Wildfire, this opens up wounds for Lizette because this teenage girl is actually pregnant, and Lizette has her own sad tragic past which resurfaces. This is a slow burn, but I really enjoyed this one. I consume most of my books mainly through audio, and the narrator makes all the difference sometimes. This one was narrated by Emily Norman, and I really enjoyed the audiobook. My 8th book was a fantasy called The Magnificence of Death by Rhea, Rainwater. This one's marketed for fans of The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and I really loved that book. Here we have the main character Astoria, and she's cursed with immortality, but also the ability to resurrect people. As you can imagine, with immortality, she lives forever whilst she has to watch the people around her pass, and she essentially lives her life drowned in grief and guilt. This special ability of resurrection she has disrupts the natural order of the world. We also have the character of Death personified named Grimm, and he follows Astoria through her many different lives, chasing her and collecting all the souls that leave. I really loved the writing in this one. The writing was so lyrical, and again, this fantasy was quite character driven. And then the last book I read in the first half of February was Galentine's Day by Rebecca Anderson. This one is a contemporary general fiction where you follow 3 different girls from teenagers into adulthood, and their tradition is that every day before Valentine's Day, they will meet up for a Galentine's Day celebration. This book is very British. I actually don't really like reading books set in the UK, but maybe it's because I'm British. I like my books set in America or anywhere else because I feel there's more of a level of escapism. But actually, I really enjoyed this one. It was so British and charming and nostalgic. Not all the characters go to uni, but it did remind me of my uni days. It's one of those books where real life events and pop culture moments get referenced. I loved the concept of these three girls having a tradition and celebrating every single year. They're all a little different, and the trajectory of their lives also veer very differently. At different stages of their life, they also become unlikable at certain points, but I felt like this was quite real whilst being humorous and charming at the same time. I feel like this is definitely one for all the British millennials out there. Of course, you don't have to be British to read this. I was skeptical at first because it doesn't have the highest ratings on Goodreads, but I don't always trust Goodreads reviews. Those were all the 9 books that I read in the first half of February. Let me know if you've read any of them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.